They had him in handcuffs. They had him in an orange jumpsuit, sitting behind a defendant's table, in a courtroom that smelled of mildew and broken promises. They had a file full of planted evidence, a compliant prosecutor, and a long history of getting away with exactly this kind of thing. Detective Gideon Harlan leaned back in his chair, arms folded, wearing the quiet smirk of a man who had already written the ending in his favour. He had no idea, not the faintest whisper of a clue, that the man sitting in those handcuffs had been waiting for this exact moment for a long time, and that the ending Gideon Harlan had written was about to be torn apart, set on fire, and buried beneath the weight of truth. The night began the way most catastrophic nights do, quietly. Kendrick Langston was driving a rented black Audi A6 through the Riverside district of Harlow City, a mid-sized metropolis in Georgia that looked respectable from the highway but rotted from the inside once you passed the welcome signs. He wore a navy wool coat, a silver watch his late father had left him, and a calm expression that never changed no matter what happened around him. Those who knew Kendrick well said his face was like still water. You could not tell the depth by looking at the surface. He stopped at a red light at the intersection of Calvert and 9th. A police cruiser pulled up beside him. The light turned green. Kendrick drove exactly 3 blocks before the cruiser's lights exploded behind him, red and blue strobing through the fog like a warning from something ancient. He pulled over. He placed both hands on the steering wheel in plain sight. He kept his breathing even. He had done this before. Every black man in America has done this before. The officer who approached his window was Detective First Class Gideon Harlan, though Kendrick would not learn the man's full name for some time. What he saw in that first moment was a wide-shouldered white man with a jaw set in a particular kind of arrogance that grows when authority goes unchecked for too long. Gideon Harlan had been with the Harlow City Police Department for a long time. He had received commendations, complaints that disappeared before they were investigated, and one internal affairs file that had been sealed under circumstances nobody wanted to discuss. Behind him, a second officer climbed out of the passenger side. This was Detective Landon Kane, younger, with close-cropped hair and eyes that darted around too much. The eyes of a man who was always calculating exits. Landon had been Gideon's partner for a long time. Everyone in the department knew that wherever Gideon went, Landon followed. And wherever Landon followed, things had a way of going badly for people who could not protect themselves. "License and registration," Gideon said. "Not please, not sir, not good evening." Just the 3 words, clipped and final, like he was already bored with the transaction. Kendrick handed over both documents without comment. Gideon studied them with the exaggerated slowness of a man performing authority rather than exercising it. "Step out of the vehicle. May I ask why I was stopped?" Gideon's eyes went flat. "Broken tail light." "Step out." The tail light was not broken. Kendrick had checked the car when he picked it up from the rental agency earlier that day. He checked everything. He always checked everything. He stepped out anyway. What happened in the next minutes happened fast, and with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this many times. Landon Kane moved to the passenger side of the Audi, while Gideon kept Kendrick standing by the driver's door. Then Gideon said he was going to conduct a pat-down for officer safety. Kendrick submitted. And during those seconds, when Kendrick's hands were on the roof and Gideon's hands were moving along his sides, Landon Kane reached into the rental car's glove compartment and placed something there. A small vacuum-sealed bag containing what appeared to be approximately 40 grams of cocaine. When Gideon walked around, opened the passenger door, looked inside, and said slowly and with theatrical surprise, "Well, I'll be damned." Kendrick Langston's expression did not change. The still water did not ripple. He was arrested. He was handcuffed. He was read his rights in a tone that suggested the officer saying them found the whole procedure tiresome. He was placed in the back of the cruiser, and as the car pulled away, Gideon Harlan glanced in the rearview mirror at the man in the back seat and said to Landon quietly, almost cheerfully, "Another one off the street." Landon laughed. Kendrick Langston, sitting in the back seat with his hands cuffed behind him and his silver watch pressing into his wrist, looked out at the fog-wrapped streets of Harlow City and thought, "Good. Now we begin." The Harlow City Police Department's holding facility smelled of bleach and despair in equal measure. The fluorescent lights buzzed at a frequency that seemed specifically designed to erode a person's sense of time. Kendrick was processed late that night, photographed, fingerprinted, stripped of his watch, his phone, his wallet, and his coat. The officer doing intake, a bored young man named Corporal Cyrus Ellis, typed everything into the system with the mechanical disinterest of someone filling out a grocery order. While Cyrus typed, Gideon Harlan stood at the counter and talked. He talked the way men talk when they have stopped being afraid of consequences, loosely, with their chest out, filling silence with the sound of their own certainty. 40 grams, Gideon said to nobody in particular. That's intent to distribute. The DA is gonna love this one. Clean arrest, clean evidence, no complications. Landon was leaning against the wall, scrolling his phone. What's his story? He say anything? Not a word. Just stared at me the whole ride like he was memorizing my face. Gideon snorted. Let him stare. Doesn't matter what he memorizes where he's going. Kendrick was placed in a holding cell. The cell contained 3 other men. A young kid who was clearly terrified, an older, heavy-set man who was asleep on the bench and snoring, and a wiry man with a tattoo on his neck who studied Kendrick for a moment before nodding once and returning to his business. Kendrick sat down on the bench, rested his arms on his knees, and waited. He had been preparing for this night for a long time. Let us be precise about who Kendrick Langston was, because the courtroom would eventually make this very clear. But in that holding cell, in those hours before dawn, he was just a man in a cage, and the system around him was operating exactly the way it had been designed to operate when it encountered men who looked like him. Kendrick had grown up in the Clifton Heights neighborhood of Atlanta, not the wealthy part, not the part that gets written about in travel magazines. He had grown up in a single-parent household with a mother who worked 2 jobs and a father who worked 3 until the third one put him in an early grave. Kendrick had been sharp since childhood, the kind of sharp that teachers sometimes recognized and sometimes resented. He had earned a scholarship to Morehouse, then a full ride to Georgetown Law, where he graduated 3rd in his class. He had clerked for a federal judge in the 11th Circuit. He had worked for a long time as an assistant United States attorney, prosecuting organized crime and public corruption cases with a conviction rate that made older attorneys uncomfortable in the way that excellence sometimes does. In the time before this night, Kendrick Langston had been appointed to a position that most people in the room that night would never have guessed existed: Special Investigative Counsel to the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, Office of Police Accountability. His specific mandate, his very specific and classified mandate, was to build prosecutable federal cases against law enforcement agencies engaged in systematic evidence planting, civil rights violations, and organized corruption. He had been investigating Harlow City PD for a long time. He had been investigating Gideon Harlan for most of that time. In the holding cell late that night, one of the other inmates, the young, terrified one, asked Kendrick what he was in for. "Planted evidence," Kendrick said. The kid nodded slowly, as if this was not a surprising answer. "You got a lawyer?" "I have access to one." "Public defender?" "No," Kendrick said. "Not a public defender." He did not say more than that. He sat in the buzz of the fluorescent lights and waited. Harlow City's district attorney's office was run by a man named Malcolm Whitaker, a career politician who had been DEA for a long time and possessed the kind of well-tailored confidence that comes from never having lost anything that mattered. Malcolm was tall, silver-haired, and possessed of a handshake so firm it bordered on aggression. He was not a stupid man, but he was a man who had made his peace with the machinery of his office, including the parts that bent. Malcolm's lead prosecutor on drug cases was a woman named Sienna Vargas, efficient, razor-precise, with a reputation for high conviction rates that she protected with the ferocity of someone who understood exactly how much those numbers meant to her career. Sienna was not corrupt in the way that Gideon Harlan was corrupt. She was corrupt in a subtler, more common way. She believed what the police told her, asked few questions that might complicate the answers, and defined justice largely as winning. When Sienna received the file on Kendrick Langston the morning after the arrest, she reviewed it quickly. 40 grams of cocaine found in the vehicle. Clean chain of custody documentation. Gideon and Landon were always meticulous about their paperwork, another reason they had never been caught. The defendant had no prior record, which Sienna noted briefly as unusual, but not disqualifying. She set bail at a number that would be difficult for most people to meet, and scheduled arraignment for later. Nobody at the DA's office ran Kendrick Langston's name through the federal databases. Nobody called his employer. Nobody asked why a man with no criminal record was driving through the Riverside district late at night with 40 grams of cocaine in his glove compartment. Nobody asked why the rental car agreement in his name showed no prior issues with the vehicle. They saw what they expected to see and moved forward with the efficiency of a system that had learned long ago that asking certain questions was bad for throughput. Meanwhile, Kendrick Langston had made one phone call from the holding cell that morning. He called a number in Washington, D.C. The phone rang twice. A woman answered. Her name was Amina Okoro, and she was the deputy director of the DOJ's Civil Rights Division. Her voice, when she heard Kendrick's voice, shifted from professional to something more alert. "Tell me," she said. "It happened," Kendrick said. "Harlan and Kane, exactly as we expected, exactly as documented in the previous cases." A pause. "Are you all right?" "Completely. I need you to let it run. Don't make any calls to the DA's office. Don't send anyone. Let it go to arraignment, and let it go to trial if it gets there. Another pause. Longer this time. Kendrick, that could be. I know what it could be. Let it run. I need them comfortable. Amina Okoro was quiet for a moment. You have everything you need. I have everything I've had for a long time. I just need a courtroom. He hung up. He sat back down on the holding cell bench. He folded his hands. He waited. Later, Kendrick Langston appeared in Courtroom 7 of the Harlow County Superior Court for his arraignment. He was wearing the clothes he had been arrested in, slightly rumpled, and he had declined the public defender who had been assigned to him, electing instead to represent himself pro se. This caused the clerk, who processed the paperwork, to raise an eyebrow but say nothing. The presiding judge at arraignment was the Honourable Clara Hale, known for her impatience with theatrical lawyers and her meticulous adherence to procedure. She had seen everything, or believed she had. Sienna Vargas stood at the prosecution table, looking crisp and prepared. Gideon Harlan sat in the gallery behind her, still wearing that quiet smirk. Landon Kane was beside him, scrolling his phone until a bailiff told him to put it away. Kendrick stood at the defense table alone. Judge Hale looked at him over her glasses. Mr. Langston, you've elected to represent yourself at this proceeding. Yes, Your Honour. You understand that you have the right to counsel? I do. And you're waiving that right? For today's proceeding, yes. I'll be securing representation before trial. Judge Hale looked at him for a beat longer than standard. There was something in the way the defendant stood. Not defiant, not nervous, just composed in a way that did not quite fit the room's expectations of him. She made a small mental note and moved on. The charges were read. Possession of a controlled substance with intent to distribute. Kendrick entered a plea of not guilty. Sienna Vargas moved for the bail figure she had already set. Kendrick did not contest it, which was odd because the bail figure was high. Most defendants at this point would be scrambling, calling family, calculating what a bondsman would cost, doing the math on how long they could survive in a cage. Kendrick simply said, I'll post the full amount by end of business, Your Honour. Sienna Vargas turned to look at him. Judge Hale looked at him. Even the court reporter, a middle-aged woman who had worked this court for a long time, looked up from her stenography machine. Gideon Harlan's smirk slipped exactly 1 degree. Kendrick Langston paid the full cash bail by late afternoon and walked out of the Harlow County Correctional Facility into the thin sunlight. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, straightened his coat, and called a number on his personal cell phone, a different phone than the one that had been confiscated during booking, because Kendrick Langston carried 2 phones always. I'm out, he said. Start preparing the filings. We're close to the end. What happened in the time between Kendrick Langston's arraignment and his trial was not visible to anyone in Harlow City. It was happening in Washington, D.C., in secure federal offices with sealed-door protocols, and in a rented conference room in a law firm in Atlanta that had been swept for listening devices twice before the first meeting. The attorney Kendrick had secured, the one he told Judge Hale he would be finding, was a man named Sebastian Vale. Sebastian was semi-retired and one of the most decorated civil litigation attorneys in the southeastern United States. He had argued cases before the Supreme Court. He had a reputation for surgical cross-examination that former opponents described consistently and with a kind of traumatized reverence, as like being autopsied while still alive. Sebastian Vale had also been Kendrick's mentor at Georgetown Law years earlier. When Sebastian sat down across from Kendrick in that conference room in Atlanta and opened the case file that Kendrick slid across the table, he was quiet for a long time, not because he was surprised, but because he was reading carefully, the way a surgeon reads a scan before picking up a scalpel. The file contained years of documentation. It was organized into 7 sections. The first section covered the history of Gideon Harlan and Landon Kane, their careers, their commendation records, and their disciplinary history, including the complaints that had disappeared and the sealed internal affairs file. The second section contained surveillance data, vehicle movements, phone records obtained through federal warrant, and time-stamped photographs. The third section contained the sworn testimonies of 11 previous defendants, black men and 1 black woman, who had been arrested by Harlan and Kane on drug charges that Kendrick's investigation had identified as almost certainly involving planted evidence. 4 of those defendants had already served portions of prison sentences. 2 were still incarcerated. Section 4 was a forensic analysis of the drug evidence chain of custody in 8 cases, including Kendrick's, conducted by a federal laboratory. The analysis identified a specific batch marker in the cocaine used in 3 different cases, separated by time, meaning the drugs planted in 3 different defendants' vehicles had come from the same source. Section 5 was financial. Gideon Harlan had a savings account that did not match his salary, a lake house purchased in his wife's maiden name, and his daughter's tuition at a private college paid in full through an LLC that forensic accountants had traced through layers of corporate paperwork to a mid-level drug distributor named Damon Reed, who operated in the Riverside district of Harlow City. Section 6 was the operational record of Kendrick's own investigation, including the night of the arrest, documented in advance, the route he had driven, deliberately selected, the rental car deliberately chosen and rented under his own name to create a clean paper trail, the tail light inspected and verified functional before he set out, and the body camera he had been wearing disguised as a lapel pin that had recorded Gideon Harlan's approach, the entirety of the traffic stop, and the minutes in which Landon Kane had been alone on the passenger side of the vehicle. Section 7 was the federal charges already drafted, reviewed, and approved by senior DOJ attorneys, awaiting only the completion of the state trial to ensure that every piece of evidence had been introduced into the public record under oath before the federal hammer dropped. Sebastian Vale closed the file. He looked at Kendrick for a long moment. "You let them arrest you?" "Yes." "You let them put you in a cage for hours?" "I know." "Why didn't you identify yourself the moment they approached the car?" Kendrick was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands on the table. "Because 11 people before me didn't have the option I had. They couldn't identify themselves as federal officers and make the problem go away. They just went to jail. So I needed to understand completely, personally, in my body, what they experienced. And I needed a courtroom where everything these men have done would be put on record under oath, in public, not in a sealed federal filing, in public, where every person in this city can see it. Sebastian Vale looked at him for another long moment. Then he opened the file again. "Tell me when you want to start," he said. The trial of the state of Georgia versus Kendrick Langston began on a morning in the Harlow County Superior Court. Courtroom 12 held approximately 90 spectators in its gallery. On the day the trial opened, nearly every seat was filled. This was unusual for a drug possession case. Word had gotten around, not about who Kendrick really was, because that information was still sealed, but about the fact that this defendant had paid the full cash bail without blinking, that he had walked into the arraignment without a lawyer and seemed completely untroubled by it, and that the attorney now sitting beside him was Sebastian Vale, whose face had been on the cover of legal reviews multiple times. Gideon Harlan was in the gallery again, suit and tie today. Less smirk, more surveillance. He was watching Kendrick and Sebastian Vale with the quiet attention of a man who had begun to wonder, just barely, if something was slightly off. Landon Kane was not in the gallery. He had called in sick that morning with what he told the desk sergeant was a stomach bug. The desk sergeant had not asked follow-up questions. Judge Clara Hale presided. Sienna Vargas prosecuted. Sebastian Vale defended. The first day was standard. Sienna Vargas laid out the prosecution's case with her usual precision. The stop, the discovery, the chain of custody, the lab analysis confirming cocaine. She called Corporal Cyrus Ellis to testify about the booking procedure. She called a forensic chemist from the state crime lab who confirmed the substance was cocaine hydrochloride, approximately 41 grams, consistent with intent to distribute quantities. Sebastian Vale's cross-examination of Ellis was brief, almost bored. His cross of the chemist was precise and technical, asking about the batch analysis methodology in a way that confused Sienna Vargas and seemed to bore the jury, though two jurors were watching with sharper attention than they had been showing all day. At the end of the first day, as the courtroom emptied, Gideon Harlan found Sienna Vargas in the corridor. "What is Vale doing?" Gideon asked. "His job," Sienna said, with the slight irritation of someone who does not enjoy being questioned by witnesses. "Slow down. Don't get paranoid." "I'm not paranoid. You'll take the stand tomorrow. Tell the same story you've told before. It always works." Gideon nodded. He walked to the elevator, but as the doors closed, the smirk was gone entirely. The following day, Gideon Harlan took the stand in the morning. Sienna Vargas walked him through the arrest with practiced smoothness. The traffic stop, the tail light. He was specific and confident about the tail light, the pat-down, the discovery of the drugs. He was good on the stand. Years of experience. The easy authority of a man accustomed to being believed. The jury watched him the way juries watch cops, with a baseline of deference that prosecutors understand and count on. Then Sebastian Vale stood up. He stood slowly, the way older men stand when they are conserving energy for something that matters. He walked to the podium. He set down a single sheet of paper. He looked at Gideon Harlan for a moment, without speaking, in the way that skilled cross-examiners sometimes do, letting the witness wonder, letting the room's attention sharpen. "Detective Harlan," Sebastian said, and his voice was completely, almost unnervingly calm. "You testified that you observed a broken tail light on my client's vehicle at the time of the stop." "That's correct." And that broken tail light was the basis for the traffic stop. Yes. Sebastian Vale picked up the sheet of paper. I'm going to enter Defense Exhibit a certified maintenance and inspection record from the rental agency, confirming that the vehicle rented by my client was inspected and all external lights were in full working order before the stop. He handed the exhibit to the clerk. Sienna Vargas was already on her feet. Objection. Foundation. The exhibit includes the signature of the certified mechanic and a notarized statement. Foundation is established, Your Honor. Judge Hale looked at the document. Overruled. Sebastian Vale turned back to Gideon. In light of this inspection record, can you explain why the tail light was broken? Gideon's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. Lights can break between an inspection and an encounter. Happens all the time. Sebastian Vale nodded slowly. It happens, he said, setting down the paper. Detective Harlan, during the stop, you conducted a pat-down of my client. Is that correct? For officer safety, yes. And during that pat-down, your partner, Detective Kane, was positioned on the passenger side of the vehicle. He was securing the perimeter. He was alone on the passenger side of a stopped vehicle for several minutes. He was doing his job. Sebastian Vale reached down and picked up a tablet. Defense Exhibit B, Your Honor. I'd like to display a video recording. Sienna Vargas was on her feet again. Objection. The defense has not previously disclosed. This was disclosed in the exhibit list filed with the court this morning. Exhibit B is described as an audio-visual recording of the traffic stop event. The prosecution received that filing. Judge Hale looked at Sienna Vargas. Counsel, did you receive the exhibit list? Sienna Vargas's composure flickered for the first time. I received it, Your Honor, but I haven't. The exhibit is admissible. Proceed, Mr. Vale. The court's display screen lit up. The footage was clear. The angle was from Kendrick's own chest, pointed slightly downward and to the right toward the passenger window of the Audi. The timestamp ran, and for several minutes, Landon Kane could be seen moving around the passenger side of the vehicle. At one point, Landon leaned into the passenger window. His hand moved toward the glove compartment. He opened it. His hand went in. His hand came out. The glove compartment closed. Moments later, Gideon Harlan walked around to the passenger door and opened it. He leaned in. He straightened up. His face turned partially toward the camera he did not know existed, wearing an expression that was trying very hard to look like surprise. The courtroom was completely silent. Somewhere in the gallery, a woman inhaled sharply. Gideon Harlan on the witness stand had gone the colour of old paper. Detective Harlan, Sebastian Vale said, and his voice was completely, almost unnervingly calm. Can you identify the man placing an object in my client's glove compartment? Gideon said nothing. For the record, Detective, is that your partner? Landon Kane. The room was still holding its breath. I want a lawyer, Gideon Harlan said. The courtroom erupted. Judge Clara Hale needed her gavel 3 times before the noise subsided to the level where she could speak and be heard. When it finally did, she looked at Sienna Vargas with an expression that contained multitudes, confusion, professional discomfort, and something that was rapidly becoming alarm. Counsel, she said to Sienna Vargas, do you want a recess? Sienna Vargas was standing at her table, looking at the frozen frame on the display screen. Landon Kane's hand at the edge of the glove compartment, with the expression of someone who has just realized that the building they are standing in is not the building they thought it was. Your Honor, she said, and her voice was remarkably steady for someone who appeared to be experiencing the slow-motion collapse of her professional assumptions. The people request a recess. 30 minutes, Judge Hale said. She struck her gavel. This court is recessed. She stood, and before she walked to her chambers, she looked at Kendrick Langston for a longer beat than before. The still water, the composed face. Something in her expression shifted, though she said nothing. The gallery emptied in the controlled chaos of 100 people all trying to make phone calls at the same time. Sebastian Vale leaned toward Kendrick and said very quietly, "Ready?" "Almost," Kendrick said. During the recess, two things happened simultaneously. In the courthouse corridor, Gideon Harlan called Landon Kane. The call went to voicemail. He called again. Voicemail. He called a third time, and this time a different voice answered. A voice Gideon did not recognize. Calm and professional. "This is Special Agent Silas Grant of the FBI's Civil Rights Unit. Detective Kane is in federal custody. Is this Detective Harlan?" Gideon hung up. He stood in the courthouse corridor with his phone in his hand, and for the first time in a very long time, Gideon Harlan felt afraid. In Malcolm Whitaker's office on the 4th floor, Sienna Vargas was on her phone with the DA himself, speaking in the clipped, low tones of someone delivering news they are still processing. Malcolm Whitaker, for his part, was very still in his large leather chair, asking short, precise questions and receiving answers that made his silver hair seem somehow to have gone slightly greyer. When court reconvened, Sienna Vargas stood and said something she had likely never said in years of prosecution. "Your Honor, the people move to dismiss all charges against the defendant." Judge Hale looked at her for a beat. "On what grounds?" "Evidence tampering. The integrity of the arrest has been compromised." "The motion to dismiss is granted," Judge Hale said. She paused. She looked at Sebastian Vale. "Mr. Vale, any objection?" "No objection to dismissal, Your Honor." Sebastian Vale paused. "However, the defense has an additional motion." "I'll hear it." Sebastian Vale placed both hands on the podium. "Your Honor, we move that the court receive into evidence the full investigative file compiled over time by my client." He paused, and this was the pause that every person in that room would remember for the rest of their lives. Special Investigative Counsel Kendrick A. Langston of the United States Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. The silence that followed was not ordinary silence. It was the silence of a room in which something structural had just shifted, like the moment after an earthquake when everything has stopped moving, but nothing is the same as it was. Judge Hale's reading glasses came off her nose slowly. She looked at Kendrick Langston. "The defendant is a federal officer." Kendrick stood. He had been waiting for this moment for a long time, and the expression on his face was not triumph. It was quieter than that, more settled. The expression of someone who has been carrying something for a very long time and has finally been allowed to set it down. "Special Investigative Counsel?" "Yes, Your Honor. My identification and credentials are in Defense Exhibit C, along with a letter from the Deputy Director of the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division confirming my appointment and the mandate of my investigation." He reached into his jacket pocket and produced the documents. They were passed to the clerk. They were handed to Judge Hale. She read them in silence while the entire courtroom watched her face change. Then she set the documents down on her bench, and she looked out at the gallery, and she found Gideon Harlan sitting 4 rows back, with his hands on his knees, and his face completely empty of its smirk. And she said in a voice that was entirely controlled but contained something hard as granite underneath. "Bailiff, please detain Detective Harlan." The next period moved with the speed of things that have been building for a long time and finally have no more resistance. Gideon Harlan was arrested in courtroom 12. He was handcuffed in the same courtroom where he had been expecting to watch Kendrick Langston convicted. He was walked past the gallery, past the spectators who had come for an ordinary drug trial and were leaving with something they would be talking about for the rest of their lives, in a silence that was more devastating than any noise could have been. Landon Kane, as Gideon had already discovered, had been picked up by the FBI's team before court had even reconvened, at his apartment complex on the south side of Harlow City. Landon had answered his door in a bathrobe, under the impression that it was the building's superintendent. It was not. He had not reportedly said anything for the first minutes of federal custody, and then had said quite a lot. The DA's office began its internal review that afternoon. Malcolm Whitaker issued a statement announcing that his office was cooperating fully with federal investigators and conducting a comprehensive review of all drug cases prosecuted in recent times that had originated with arrests by Harlan and Kane. The statement did not mention that Malcolm had been told privately by an FBI liaison that the review was not optional and that his own office's handling of potentially tainted evidence was also being examined. Sienna Vargas was not named in any initial releases, but Sienna Vargas, sitting in her office that evening after everyone else had left, looking at the case files she was now seeing differently, the ones she had taken at face value, the ones she had processed through the machinery without asking the questions she should have asked, was doing her own accounting, and the accounting was not coming out in her favor. She would later cooperate with federal investigators and testify against Harlan and Kane. She would later acknowledge in a sworn deposition that she had pursued convictions with a willful incuriosity about their foundations. She would lose her position at the DA's office. She would not be criminally charged. This was the subject of considerable debate. In the Riverside district of Harlow City, a man named Damon Reed, the mid-level drug distributor connected to Gideon Harlan's lake house financing, was arrested by a joint FBI and DEA task force at a warehouse. He had been cooperating with federal investigators under a proffer agreement for a long time. The cooperation had begun when Kendrick Langston's investigation had identified him and offered an arrangement, full disclosure in exchange for a reduced sentence. Damon Reed, who was a pragmatic man, had taken the deal. It was one of the evidentiary foundations of the financial section of Kendrick's file. By the time the dust settled, the tally of arrests directly connected to Kendrick Langston's investigation stood at Gideon Harlan, Landon Kane, and several other officers whose names had emerged from Landon's cooperation and Damon Reed's testimony. A further arrest came later, a police captain named Arthur Crowe, who had been for a long time the administrative architecture that made it possible for the Harlan operation to function without internal affairs interference. It was Arthur Crowe who had sealed the original internal affairs file on Harlan. It was Arthur Crowe whose retirement account contained unexplained deposits. It was Arthur Crowe who, upon being arrested at his home in a gated community in the northwest suburbs of Harlow City, reportedly sat down on his front porch steps and wept. The case that Kendrick Langston had built, years of documentation, the financial trail, the forensic analysis, the body camera footage, was submitted in its entirety to the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Georgia. The federal charges against Gideon Harlan alone numbered multiple counts, including civil rights violations, evidence tampering, conspiracy, drug distribution, facilitation, and wire fraud. The previous defendants, whose cases were identified as potentially tainted, including several who had served prison time and others who were still incarcerated, had their cases referred for immediate review by the Georgia Innocence Project and a special federal review panel. In the time that followed, some of the incarcerated men were released pending full case reviews. Their names, which deserve to be said clearly, were Jamal Hayes, who had served months of a sentence, and Tyrone Ellis, who had served more than a year of another sentence. Jamal Hayes' mother, a woman named Rosa Hayes, gave a brief statement outside the correctional facility on the day her son walked out. She said only, "I never stopped believing he was telling the truth." Then she held her son and did not say anything else for a long time. The federal trial of Gideon Harlan began after his arrest and lasted for some time. Sebastian Vale was not the lead attorney in that trial. Federal prosecutors do not typically work with defense attorneys in that role, but he was present, seated in the gallery, watching with the patient attention of a man who has already done his part. Kendrick Langston testified over 2 sessions, calm, precise, comprehensive, laying out the architecture of his long investigation with the methodical thoroughness of someone who had spent his career understanding how to make juries understand complicated things. Gideon Harlan's defense team worked hard. They argued entrapment, that Kendrick had manufactured a situation to ensnare their client. The argument did not survive contact with the video evidence, the financial records, the forensic batch analysis connecting separate drug plant cases, and Landon Kane's cooperation testimony, which was detailed and specific and devastating in the way that testimony from a co-conspirator who has made peace with his fate tends to be. Gideon Harlan was convicted on most counts. The jury deliberated for some time. When the verdict was read, Gideon Harlan stood at the defense table and his face was completely still. Not composed the way Kendrick's face was composed, but emptied out. The expression of a man from whom something fundamental has been removed. He had spent a long time protected by the weight of institutional authority, by the predictability of a system that treated certain men's testimony as gold and other men's as suspect. For a long time, the machinery had worked, and now the machinery was looking at him. He was sentenced to years in federal prison. Landon Kane, who had cooperated and testified, received a reduced sentence. Arthur Crowe was sentenced to years. Malcolm Whitaker was not charged, but was not re-elected. He announced before the election that he would not be seeking another term. The statement cited a desire to spend more time with family. Nobody who read it believed that was the reason, including presumably Malcolm Whitaker himself. In the sentencing statement for Gideon Harlan, the federal judge said something that was widely quoted and reprinted in the time that followed. He said the defendant spent a long time using the authority of his badge to treat certain citizens as targets rather than as people deserving of protection. He relied systematically on the assumption that those targets would lack the resources, the credibility, or the power to hold him accountable. He was, in that assumption, catastrophically wrong, and the weight of that error will be measured in the years he now spends in a federal prison, years that bear no relationship to the years that Jamal Hayes and Tyrone Ellis and others lost. Gideon Harlan was taken from the courtroom by federal marshals. His wife, seated in the gallery, did not look up from her lap. His daughter, who had been in the courtroom every day, stood and walked out before the marshals reached the door. She did not look back. In the time that followed the trial, several things happened that did not make headlines, but mattered. Jamal Hayes enrolled in a community college in Atlanta, studying business administration. He was starting over with the particular determination of someone who understands exactly what they are starting over from. A non-profit connected to the Georgia Innocence Project provided partial tuition support. Jamal also filed a civil lawsuit against the city of Harlow and the Harlow City Police Department, represented pro bono by a civil rights firm in Atlanta. The suit settled later for a substantial amount. Tyrone Ellis was older by the time his full exoneration was complete. He had worked as an electrician before his arrest. After his release, he returned to that work. His employer, a small electrical contracting company in Harlow City run by a man named Pete Holloway, had held his position open on the basis that he had never believed the conviction. Pete Holloway later told a reporter that he had hired Tyrone back the same week the exoneration came through, and that Tyrone had shown up on Monday morning and worked a full day without saying much about any of it. "That's just who Tyrone is," Pete said. Rosa Hayes, Jamal's mother, became a central figure in a Harlow City community organization called the Alliance for Justice in Policing, which had existed before the Harlan case but grew considerably in the aftermath. She gave interviews. She attended city council meetings. She was, by the accounts of everyone who encountered her, formidable. Kendrick Langston continued his work with the DOJ Civil Rights Division. The Harlow City case became a template studied, analysed, and referenced in federal training materials as a model for how systematic evidence planting could be documented and prosecuted. Kendrick gave one interview to a national publication in which he was asked how he had endured the hours in the holding cell, knowing who he was and what he knew. His answer, which was run as a pull quote, was, "I endured it because 11 people before me endured it without the option of ending it when they chose. The least I could do was understand what they went through. The most I could do was make sure it mattered." He declined all subsequent interview requests. The body camera footage, the minutes of Landon Kane placing the evidence, was viewed millions of times on various platforms within the first period after its public release. A legal commentator called it one of the most consequential pieces of body camera footage in the history of American policing cases. This was possibly an overstatement, but it was also possibly not. The Harlow City Police Department underwent a federal consent decree that mandated independent oversight, mandatory body camera policies, and a complete restructuring of its internal affairs division. The implementation was slow, contested at every stage by various institutional interests, and imperfect. It was also, by most accounts of those who watched it closely, more than had ever happened before. In the time after the trial, Kendrick Langston returned to Harlow City for the first time since the verdict. He came quietly, without announcement. He drove through the Riverside district, not in a rented Audi this time, but in his own car, a grey Ford Explorer that had many miles on it and a crack in the passenger side sun visor. He drove down Calvert Street, past the intersection with 9th, and he stopped for a moment at the red light. He sat there for the length of one full light cycle. Then he drove on. What he was thinking during those minutes, he never said. Maybe there was nothing that needed to be said about it. Some reckonings are private. Some justice is internal, the kind you carry in your body, rather than announce from a podium. He drove out of the Riverside district and onto the highway, and the fog-wrapped streets of Harlow City disappeared in his rearview mirror. And he went home. There is something important to say about this story that is not contained in the verdicts or the headlines or the millions of views of the footage. 11 people, 11 real, specific, breathing human beings had been arrested by Gideon Harlan and Landon Kane and placed in cages and processed through a system that treated their denials of guilt as noise and their convictions as metrics. Jamal Hayes had lost months. Tyrone Ellis had lost more. The other 9 had lost various portions of various years, probations, records, jobs they could not get, housing they could not qualify for, family structures that had shifted under the weight of absence in ways that do not reverse when a court filing says they should. A federal review panel identified that the financial and professional damage done to the 11 identified victims totaled, in aggregate, millions in lost wages, legal costs, incarceration costs, and downstream economic effects. This figure does not include the unquantifiable, the weight of being disbelieved, the erosion of faith in the institutions that were supposed to protect you, the particular exhaustion of being the kind of person the system treats as a target. Gideon Harlan, in his years in federal prison, would have time to consider what he had done. Whether he used that time for genuine reckoning or for the construction of narratives that made him the victim of his own story is a question nobody outside his cell can answer. People who knew him said he had always been good at constructing those narratives. They said he had the specific talent of a man who has convinced himself completely and almost sincerely that his version of events is the true one. Whether time is enough to dismantle that kind of self-deception, nobody knows. Landon Kane, at his reduced sentence with parole possible, had reportedly requested from within the federal facility a meeting with Jamal Hayes' attorney. The request was passed along. Jamal Hayes' attorney forwarded it to Jamal. Jamal's response was brief. Not yet. Not yet is not never. It is also not forgiveness. And nobody with any sense would ask Jamal Hayes to move faster towards something he will arrive at on his own terms, or not at all. Sienna Vargas went into private practice, handling real estate contracts and estate planning. She was not the villain of this story in the clean, simple sense. She was something more uncomfortable than a villain. She was a person who had had every opportunity to see what was in front of her and had chosen consistently and professionally not to look. Her cooperation with federal investigators at the end had been genuine, in the sense that she had answered every question fully and truthfully once the alternative was no longer viable. Whether that counted as moral redemption or merely as pragmatic self-preservation was a question she was presumably spending her evenings working on. Malcolm Whitaker took a position at a private law firm handling corporate compliance. He gave no interviews. Arthur Crowe was in a federal correctional facility. He had, by the accounts of prison staff who spoke anonymously to a journalist writing a follow-up piece later, become something of a quiet presence in the facility. Not a troublemaker, not a leader, just a man sitting with the weight of what he had enabled. He had requested access to the mental health counseling program. He had been granted it. The lake house in Tennessee that Gideon Harlan had purchased under his wife's maiden name, the one whose existence was a key piece of Kendrick's financial investigation, was liquidated as part of the asset forfeiture proceedings. The proceeds went in part to a restitution fund for the identified victims. Jamal Hayes received a check. Tyrone Ellis received a check. So did the others. The checks were, by the standards of what had been taken from them, small. Money always is in these situations. The law does its best, which is better than nothing and worse than enough. This story happened because one man refused to walk away from the truth. For a long time, Kendrick Langston could have filed his report from a safe distance. He could have built the case without putting himself in a cell. He chose differently. He chose to understand in his body, and not just his mind, what Jamal Hayes and Tyrone Ellis and others had experienced. And in doing so, he built something that no amount of institutional inertia could ignore. Gideon Harlan sat in that courtroom believing he had already won. He had won before by the accounting of his victims. He had every reason to believe he would win again. He forgot one thing, that the man sitting in those handcuffs had been building the case against him for longer than he could imagine. Justice is slow. It is imperfect. It does not heal everything it touches. But when it arrives, when it finally, undeniably arrives, it arrives with a weight that no smirk can hold. If this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you of the quiet battles fought every day for justice, if it made you feel the importance of the work that goes unseen, then do something about it. Hit like, share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story we tell, because the stories that deserve to be told deserve an audience, and that audience is you.